All right, as a part of my ongoing project relating to ancient dreams and ancient philosophy and other interesting topics that, or at least interesting to me, that I'm going to cover on the show, I've also been reading a lot of other books about dreaming in altered states of consciousness that don't quite, fit into the ancient category. So I figured that since this is a much larger topic that I still need to plan out, I might as well burn all this material that doesn't have a place. So that's today's episode on opium, the romantics, and dreaming. This spiel is going to be covering the topics of opium dreams, romantic era poets, experience both with opium and regular dreaming. To pull a general quote from one of the books I read, it says, "They contain the three cardinal romantic doctrines on dreams, that they are a revelation of reality, that they can form and influence waking life, and that the dream process is a parallel and model of the process of poetic creation." When getting into the romantic poets, there is this overhang of sorts. There's a theme of dreaming, but there's also the theme of the emergence of opium as a drug that a lot of these people took, and there was always debate about how much it influenced their work and what their thoughts on dreaming and everything were. So let's get into that. And to start here, I want to talk a bit about opium dreams themselves and how they relate to the 19th century romantic movement and just popular notions of dreams in general. So first, the idea of the opium dream is one in which you smoke opium and start to see these fantastic visions and somewhat alien worlds. It's a realm that's different from the regular dream state, and supposedly the visions caused by the drug are, again, quite influential in theory in the creative process, namely among these 19th century romantic poets. For instance, Keats. So if maybe you had to read Kubla Khan in high school or college if your high school was retired. I'm not sure which is the case for you. Maybe you never got to it. Maybe you were really, really remedial. In that case, it's one of the most, it's a famous poem, it's an unfinished poem, and it's one of the most well-known examples of opium having an influence or possibly having an influence in poetry of that time period. Opium usage in this way as a means of spurring creativity was greatly popularized by the success of Thomas de Quincy's book Confessions of an Opium Eater, which was published in 1821. So much in the same way psychedelic music of the 60s was influential in usage of LSD or weed, or modern music doing, I don't know, Molly or whatever the fuck else people are doing nowadays. That was the 19th century version of that. A popular culture expression of drug use that got a lot of people into wanting to smoke opium, or at least take the tinctures, because not everyone smoked. There were also these basically what would be pharmaceutical drugs of the era, little sort of pills and whatnot. And I'm not sure if Thomas de Quincy was the one who popularized the use of the, quote, Confessions of a fill-in-the-blank book title. If so, it's really a strike against him in my mind. I don't want to blame a 19th century drug addict for being annoying, but they've been running that title into the ground for the past 200 years. If you want to see how many, go on Amazon and go to the book section and just type in Confessions of, and see how many fucking titles come up. I hate that fucking title. Anyway, besides that, one of the books I'm pulling information from is Opium and the Romantic Imagination by Alethea Hayter. And this book came out in the late 1960s, I believe, or mid-1960s. And she writes about De Quincy, quote, "He thought that opium promoted and intensified the dreaming faculty, and the dreams crystallized memories and feelings, particularly feelings of grief, into symbol, patterns, or involutes, as he called them." The opium dream itself has a lot of common occurrences among these different writers. They all seem to have many of the same visions, at least in my experience and what I've read from these other authors making comments on it. In addition, a lot of the same emotional impressions seem to come out of these dreams. Again, here's another quote. The poet Hartley said, this is a quote inside a quote, "A person who has taken opium sees either gay scenes or ghastly ones." And we're not going to make a gay joke here, a gay sex joke, pal. That's not happening. Although, I will say, the poet Crabbe constantly had dreams about boys made of leather, which he called the leather lads, and they chased him around and hooted at him in these dreams of his. One paper that I read on the topic, on opium and its romantic poetry influence, said that they were trying to insinuate things about Mr. Crabbe's sexuality based on that, but just because there's a leather subculture in the gay sphere doesn't mean that 19th century Mr. Crabbe was involved in 19th century version of such things, if such things existed. Like, the man was simply terrorized by boys made out of leather. What is so gay about that? Now, some other authors were more in the camp of having dreams that were depressing or just outright nightmares. Most of those involve some sort of tragedy in their own personal lives. That same paper that talked about Crabbe possibly being gay and getting chased by boys made of leather is actually more about John Keats, and it's called Drowse with the Fume of Poppies. And in that paper, it said that higher doses and depths of addiction were associated with their dreams of flight and persecution. At least according to the writings of De Quincy and George Crabbe. Remember, though, there still are those, quote, gay dreams. So the non-addicts and the early uses of the addicts themselves, the first however long they started using opium, they often had dreams and waking reveries that were absolutely euphoric in how they presented themselves. And this is really clear from the entries of Thomas de Quincy. I think the shift from like euphoric to nightmarish could also take place during the opium high itself. Not just the change in content or feelings over a long period of time, but like in the middle of the dream, you can just start freaking out about some sort of nightmare. And Hayter, in her book, even writes, a quote, "It was the euphoria and coordinating reverie of the first stage that provided the material for the dreams of the second stage. But in the second stage, the euphoria was past, and feelings of guilt, lethargy, and isolation had arrived. The dreams organized by the first stage were colored by the gloom of the second stage." So they would have this initial burst of euphoria, and then all their psychological shit would come up, which is, a lot of different drugs. Once you start getting into hallucinations and dreams and visions, I suppose you can unlock all sorts of shit. De Quincy especially seemed to have these initially euphoric waking reveries, just walking. He was really just not asleep, you're just in this haze, this daydream sort of state. But he's walking around the city, going to the theater. But his dreams themselves, when he was asleep, were the opposite of the euphoria and like feel good times. It was the faces of the people in the dreams really were like his family members, his deceased family members, and their faces were distorted when he was having these visions. De Quincy's symbolism, his so-called involutes, the feelings of all of his memories of grief and loss, all of this would get wrapped up into one consistent theme found in a lot of his dreams that he recorded and wrote down throughout his life. The hallucinations that the romantic authors had, even in the waking reveries where they'd still be going about their lives, versus a dream during sleep, they all had hallmarks of extreme distortion of both space and time, an expression into something seemingly infinite. And this is usually all taking place in the first half of the 19th century, and the distortion of space and time is a theme of modernity, especially in the second half of the 19th century. But that's through technological and industrial change less than taking drugs. So in a sense, I guess there's some connection to modernism in here as well. Another poet, one Francis Thompson, he wrote about these distortions of time and space within his poetry, he was talking about the visual and auditory hallucinations and referring to God as, quote, king of infinite space. Now, these highs, these feelings, these distortions, it's much more of a feeling, a mood, impression. It seems that while smoking opium, the visual distortions during waking reveries are there, sure, but not to the same degree as you would get with tryptamine hallucinogens, which became popular in the next century with Timothy Leary and people like that. But these were still had visions. They're not complete. They're not just simply impressions like what I was talking about on last episode of Plotinus and his communion with the One, which involved no drug taking whatsoever. So what was this imagery within these dreams? Lots of architecture-based imagery, less about visual arts than you might think. However, Hayter notes that they did hear music and poetry at times in some of these visions, and the latter two really seem to be more prevalent than other types of hallucinations. So music, poetry, architecture. The imagery outside of that was often landscapes, particularly of water-based imagery in not just regular water, but silvery water and the like. There's a lot of talk about gold and silver and even Orientalist imagery creeping in, which was popular at the time otherwise in terms of art and poetry and the Romantic movement in general. And Charles Baudelaire, the French poet, wrote about his experiences later in a book called The Artificial Paradise. And this came out decades after De Quincy wrote Confessions of an Opium Eater, but Baudelaire is, referencing that book and talking about his own experiences on a variety of drugs. And Baudelaire is making plenty of comparisons between smoking hashish and smoking opium. It's a lot that there is a lot of the same imagery in terms of water. So waves, fountains, waterfalls are both things that would come up constantly while smoking hashish and opium too. Plus, both of the drugs distorted, again, time and space. But hash, he said, was not a mellow experience the same sort of mellow experience you get with opium. And he also says that taking opium and drinking wine makes you feel, powerful. So if you're looking for a drug mix, apparently that's the shit. And he calls it a Bacchic exaltation and not that usual mellowed out feeling that you usually get with opium. So you take that shit with some wine, and that's not a suggestion on my part. I'm just reporting what the 19th century said. Don't smoke opium. Wine, knock yourself out. And Baudelaire, he wrote that dreams produced under the influence of hashish were pretty much just drawn from waking life. There weren't anything special, nothing extraordinary, just usually distorted aspects of your waking life. Lots of colors, weirdness, but everything was still pretty familiar to waking reality otherwise. So hash, even though Baudelaire talks about it's not a drug that really needs to be explored for our purposes in this presentation, but I will just add another piece of info, which Keats, the poet, in his poem Fall of Hyperion, may also be making a reference to hashish. And Keats talks about the Ismaili assassins taking a drug potion and entering a dream world. And he writes that it's not opium that they took. Now, if you're unfamiliar, the assassins are pretty notorious historically for being hash eaters. Some have even said that that's where the name assassin originated, the hashashin, or hash eaters, though it seems pretty doubtful. It's probably not the case, as well as it's probably not the case. The majority of people who were carrying out assassinations were high off hash before or after doing it, or during doing it. Or it was more likely that some of the leaders of the assassin sect in the Middle East, where this was all taking place, they might have been giving their foot soldiers hashish as a taste of the paradise they promised to them if they succeeded in carrying out their missions, right? Either way, the imagery of the Orient, real or imagined, factored pretty heavily into both Romantic poetry on the whole and poetry within the period, which has a apparent opium or hash-based influence on the language. But even the imagery has its influence dating back to the writings of Marco Polo. And, it's not anything drug-based. So a lot of the imagery that comes up in these opium-infused poems are actually just images taken from Orientalist writings, or whether real or imagined, trips to the Middle East, the Orient, China, wherever. And these writings are including Marco Polo's journeys. And he's writing about the assassin's palace or hideout and how it's designed to invoke imagery of paradise as described by Muhammad in the Quran. So beautiful gardens, milk, honey, water flows with large spacious rooms and architecture on a fairly grand scale, which all comes about in the romantic poetry that's supposedly infused with opium dreams. And the description from Marco Polo sounds a lot more lively and organic versus what you get in romantic poetry a lot of the times that is influenced by opium. It's similar, but the opium dreams are, again, very metallic, and the landscapes are barren. There's not this lush garden, land of milk and honey. It's silvery water and vast, empty architectural spaces that are kind of dead. Keats, in his poem Fall of Hyperion, feels a lot more attuned to what Marco Polo is talking about. Again, it's a lush world that the sect of the assassins are transported to in that poem. Some of Keats's actual dreams that we have record of may lend some further support to the idea that he used opium during his life. He died pretty famously early at the age of 25, and there is some record of him taking a hit to the face, which he survived. It was a pretty brutal hit, apparently, accident, and may have been given some kind of opium or opium tincture as a pain reliever. Beyond that, he eventually succumbs to tuberculosis, which is also what killed his brother. As such, it's not too much of a stretch to suggest that he took laudanum during his last months, or even longer than that, to help cope with both the loss of his brother and catching tuberculosis himself and the long process of illness there. Anyway, one of his actual dreams describes Keats floating along with his lover, there's a kiss, which seems to last for a long time. Again, distortion of time and space, that blissful feeling, again, opium, and a feeling of a sense of warmth in a world that's absolutely cold and not much life is going on. The imagery matches up. His injuries, his illness would suggest he would be given some sort of opium-based tincture, or again, probably not smoking it, but laudanum is probably given to him at some point during the end of his life, and probably find some influence in the poetry of Keats. Now, Baudelaire, the Frenchman, again, his opium dreams do lend further evidence to the imagery, and what was taken from those dreams are found its way into at least some of his poetry. He talks about the architectural vastness of these alien worlds, the water, metallic, marble. This is what is going on. This is what the dream world is made of. A strange sight that is ultimately a sterile and lifeless one. And Baudelaire writes on the imagery, quote, "the dull sky and veiled horizon which overshadow the brain enslaved by opium." Pretty clear cut there. The dullness is only sometimes in these dreams. Again, we have that euphoric state that also presents itself within the dreams. The colors during these euphoric states are more intense and diverse. The metallic aspects are still there with silver and gold. The horizon seems vast. Lots of seemingly oriental architecture also coming through. And Baudelaire describes that sort of imagery as, quote, "crystal cataracts, sheets of water stretching millions of leagues to the borders of the universe. Rivers pouring from the firmaments into diamond gulfs. Oceans channeled through caverns of gems, all lit by a burnished, iridescent sheen on the metallic water. Watery metal beneath a sunless sky, and the slow, viscid majesty of movement accomplished in an endless silence. The whole universe becomes one infinite palace, boundless but imprisoning." Whereas Baudelaire describes hashish having synesthesia, he associates colors and sounds during those experiences on that drug. He doesn't have the same experience happen to him with opium. But the poets, it's really, they use imagery, the landscapes themselves, to express feeling rather than using it as strictly a visual description. Hayter writes in her book, quote, quicksands are despair, weeds on a muddy bank are obsession, sunlit lawns among ancient trees are secret raptures of repose. You feel them, you cannot see them or reproduce them in paint. So, some symbolist influence, the later symbolist poetry, writing, and paintings. And maybe I'll get into that at some point. I'll do a whole topic on that. But in the end, with all of these poets, it can be pretty, difficult to suss out how much influence opium actually had on their dreams and the subsequent writings that the drug supposedly sparked. A lot of the imagery seemed to already be in their minds, and they had ideas before and after they used the drugs. And plus, a lot of these guys weren't full-on addicts of opium, just users for a time or from time to time. Even the themes of the Quincy's writings, in terms of the moods he uses and imagery that he comes up with, were already apparent before he was taking opium, before he wrote his whole Confessions of an Opium Eater book. In terms of dreams, the drug doesn't appear to be too massive of an influence in the realm of sleep, which is our concern here. Waking visions, the distortions and weirdness is a lot more evident, but even that pulls a lot from the individual psyche and memory of that person. So again, they would be haunted by visions of their relatives and things like that, which is really just grief and repressed emotion, I don't need opium for that. I do want to move away from the opium aspect of dreams in the Romantic period. Since I have all this information, let's talk more about Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Now, he actually did take opium and kept extensive journals about his dreams and thoughts on dreams, so he's a good resource during this period to, see just what was going on in the heads of these guys. Though surprisingly, Hayter, in her book, says that he didn't talk much about opium's effects on his own creativity. So he wrote all about his dreams, talked about his dreams constantly, talked about his poetry and his inner workings all the time in his little journals, but not much there about opium and what was going on with its influence on these dreams. His interactions with dreams and his thoughts on their causes did shift over his lifetime. So unlike Keats, he lived a lot longer. He didn't die at age 25. Coleridge lived quite a while, and he always did think that dreams would stem from physical influences in the body itself. And Coleridge became more of a rationalist with his thoughts of dreams over time. Less like the ancients, which obviously influenced him during his early life, and less of the spiritual influence. Earlier, though, there was a lot more divine messenger type of readings on dreaming in general from this guy, this poet, but he often saw that his dreams as dramas within themselves, calling the characters dramatis personae. So he viewed them as basically like watching a show or a trip to the theater, watching a play, even though they could have profound emotional, psychological effects on him. In her book, Coleridge on Dreaming, Jennifer Ford talks about how one of the things that Coleridge would notice about the dramatis personae is how breathing never factored in while he was watching the show. Even if the dream was highly realistic, like all the people, he recognized the scenery and everything like that, and he thought he was really a part of this reality, the lack of breath was always a distinguishing feature between the dream world and reality, his waking world. Personally, if I ever start to tackle lucid dreaming again, that seems like a good clue to use in order to wake up within a dream. I never noticed the lack of breathing among dream characters. Maybe my people do. Maybe my fake, phony dream characters breathe all the time. I'd take a mental note and figure that one out. But another thing about Coleridge's conception of dreams that Ford writes, quote, that dreams become the primary site of proof that the soul can only be glimpsed and as such, from only one part of the entire development of the concept of self and of the individual psyche. Dreams also exist in their own mental space and can detrimentally divide the psyche. For Coleridge, dreams occupied a separate space, meaning that it was a place you visited with defined boundaries, at least in a sense, right? While it's simultaneously boundless in possibility of experience, and it follows its own rules that are separate from the waking world. However, it was also a place where you would explore your morality and the nature of evil itself. Coleridge thought of this realm as a storehouse for the raw materials of dreams, poetry, and metaphysical speculation. Even though there is some dream interpretation here, it goes beyond that into a psychological exploration of oneself. And remember, this is pre-psychoanalysis, pre-Freud and all that shit. He's already venturing into these territories a bit. And just to place him on the timeline, Coleridge is born in 1772 and he died in 1834. So this is quite a bit before psychoanalysis. And Coleridge is already getting into the depths of his psyche and dream interpretation and the physical and psychological causes of said dreams. And Coleridge wasn't just falling asleep. He was, in his mind, he was literally falling into a dream. Because, again, it's a separate place within the mind. As Ford writes, quote, "The guilt and suffering that he experienced in many dreams partly hinge on his recognition that he could just as easily fall into morally murky waters whilst dreaming as he could fall into pleasant streams and happiness." And that's one thing about Coleridge. He really did fear venturing into these places, these places in his mind sometimes. He didn't want to go there. Not just because of nightmares, which obviously that's part of it, but also the dreams compromised his sense of morality or his feeling of him being a moral person. Which basically the guy was dreaming about smashing a woman that wasn't his wife. He separated from his wife, I guess, but I don't know. I'm guessing these dreams preceded that separation at the time. But he became infatuated once the separation was official with a woman named Sarah Hutchinson. And he not only dreamed of her, he felt that his dreams were about her. That entire dreams themselves were Sarah Hutchinson. It wasn't just she was a character in the dream. She was the entirety of the dream universe itself. Then also the dramatis personae, the moods, the landscape, would serve as projections for his deepest fears and guilt. And that's another reason he didn't want to go into dreams at night, because that can be a tough thing to confront. The loss of his volition and his sense of control really splits him from the usual sense of I that he had during his waking hours. And to quote the book, Coleridge on Dreaming Again, quote, "This is why Coleridge time and time again, and particularly throughout the last 10 years of his life, describes sleep as a humiliating experience. Because reason is precariously balanced in the state of dreaming, so too is the very sense of self. It is this kind of split consciousness and taunting of the mind's own powers that Coleridge experiences in his worst nightmares. Sleep becomes an evil thing, far from the refreshing and revitalizing thing it should be. Dreams were, for him, were reflections of his sense of self and distortions of it that were reflected back at him. Though Coleridge also treated dreams much more in line with how ancient thinkers approached them. At least ancient Greek and Roman, some ancient Greek and Roman thought and early Christian thought. And again, he was more inclined to think this during the early part of his life rather than the later years. Dreams at time, he felt, could be prophetic. They could anticipate happenings in the future of the waking world. And Ford, again, summarizes his 3 general dream origin arguments like this. First, that dreams are caused by God's intervening in the lives of men. Second, that they are the result of the action of malignant spirits. And third, that his dreamer's bodily position and state of health both causes and influences dreams. And the physical and body position aspect really caught on again towards the latter part of his life. Though the spirit angle also caught a hold in his mind as well. He thought that spirits caused dreams as well as ill health, or at least both health problems and the nocturnal spirit entities that could combine to trigger certain dreams or nightmares within his dream world, his separate mental space. But then the moral quandaries he faces in dreams can't really be blamed on his own psyche or desires, since it's the spirit's fault for the dreams, not his, even if he doesn't always seem to believe that these entities exist in his writing. So he's, on the one hand, doesn't want to go into his dream because it makes him confront his deepest, the worst aspects of himself, the moral quandaries of sexualizing Sarah Hutchinson even while he's married or separated, and that's not his wife. But at the same time, he's also at least partially blaming spirits for the dreams. There were goblins and demons that were imposing these dreams on him during his sleep in order to make him see the worst aspects of themselves, or injecting these bad thoughts into him. So he's kind of, split, at least for a time, and doesn't want to really face the worst parts of himself. The physical side of things said that dreams could be influenced or caused by things like ailments. So what you ate, or even the position you fell in during sleep. If there's a pressure on a certain part of your body, you might have a certain type of dream. And this is one of my favorite examples that that causes a Coleridge dream. As in one of his dreams, he's walking around a university campus, it seems, and he's offered sex by a prostitute. And he refuses to pay her. And she it's like, okay, if you're not going to have sex with me, you're going to pay me. And the hooker, the hooker just starts chasing him. And she either does or tries to bite his dick and or balls. And then there's another hooker in the dream who, once he gets away, there's another hooker who bears her white bosom to him. So some sort of symbolism there. The entire scenario is him getting chased and trying to bargain with the university, the so-called university harlot. And there's a sensation that his balls hurt physically, either as a precursor to or as a result of the woman biting him in the dream. And that was hilarious. He basically just runs away and I think tries to throw money at her in order to make the university harlot stop pursuing him. Like the imagery of some limp-wristed British guy being like, just take the money, you slut, and flinging some coins at her is fucking funny, and about what I would expect from such a silly nanny like Samuel Taylor Coleridge. But all in all, Coleridge brought more depth to the Romantic era poets, their thoughts on dreams, that I would have otherwise gotten. The opium influence was marginal as far as creativity goes, at least from what I can tell. But Coleridge did somewhat mine the dream world for his own poetic ideas and inspiration, whatever the cause may have been, whether it was dream demons, divinely inspired physical ailments, opium, or just malignant spirits as a whole. All right, I'm not sure if this segment is completely coherent or just more of a rundown, but I really didn't have a full-fledged idea for this excess spillover from my dream research. Maybe it was I hope it was informational or somewhat entertaining, or just a good waste of time for whatever you're doing right now.